My moment was the headline of the New York Times after, I guess it was the first or second Republican debate where Trump had gone on CNN and talked about how Megyn Kelly was bleeding
Yeah,
through her
I think it was
eyes.
the first one.
Whatever, okay.
I think it was first. Yeah.
And I thought, okay, well, whatever. But it was the top headline at the top of the New York Times. And I thought, that is so strange. Why is that? To humiliate Trump to some degree? This was just something that you could kind of, talk about minimally, but to create an entire narrative over this in order to humiliate him or to get him canceled was the beginning for me of like, oh, there's something else going on. There's a secret history here.
You mentioned cancel culture before, and then I brought up the charges of misogyny related to American Psycho.
Yeah.
So I just read on your Wikipedia, and if it's on Wikipedia, it's got to be true, that you had the deal for American Psycho with Simon & Schuster, but then because, what was it, Women of Now, or the Now of Women, or something, they accused you of being misogynistic.
And I got it.
And then was the book dropped? I mean, this is sort of an early version of cancel culture.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
It was.
Clean that story up for me. I got it on Wikipedia.
Look, I had a deal at Simon & Schuster, a big deal at Simon & Schuster. I turned the book in, this is a long time ago, in December of 1989. And throughout 1990, the book kind of moved through the usual rungs of the ladder that it does through a publishing house. Getting copy edited, we figure out a cover, your editor does some basic editing on it, but there were people in the publishing house who were very offended by American Psycho, usually assistants, young people working in the publishing house. And leaks started happening. Leaks of some of the most violent passages were being sent to the press and certain members of the press. And so suddenly it became a story. And the book hadn't been published yet, but it became a story. And it became more and more controversial the more and more that these notorious scenes were leaked. And of course, out of context they're horrible. And so anyway, the controversy got louder and louder and louder. And yes, kind of like today in a way, Simon & Schuster collapsed and said, we are not going to publish this book because of the outcry in the media. Now, this is another thing that happened then, is that it was actually the corporation that owned Simon & Schuster that demanded the cancellation. It was Gulf and Western, who owned Simon & Schuster, and the head of Gulf and Western did not like the controversy, did not like the fact that his corporation was being blemished by this book, who ordered the cancellation. I knew the head of that company, of Simon & Schuster, quite well, and I knew that he wasn't the one who canceled it, but he was the fall guy. He had to take it. So anyway, that is what happened. It's a happy ending because a better publisher picked up American Psycho and they published it a few months later, and the rest is whatever it is.
Right, so it definitely ends happily and a movie's made and everything
And I have
else.
to say, one thing that's very interesting is that Tammy Bruce was the head of Now, who was the most against American Psycho. She was my nemesis then in 1991, and now...
That's hilarious. I mean,
now she's one of the leading lights, the bright lights on Fox, actually. And so I don't know, I find that kind of ironic in the way that the culture works.
I mean, that fits so much of a lot of the stuff that we've talked about privately, because I've only met Tammy Bruce once. It was at a David Horowitz Freedom Center thing, and David Horowitz was a famous lefty, children of communists,
of course.
Who then became conservative.
Yes.
And at his conference, he did a thing on sort of the new generation of former lefties that have sort of woken up, and it was me, Tammy Bruce, Candace Owens, and a couple other people. So that's the only time I met her, and it's funny, she was opposed to you back then, and here you are. That's actually a great segue for a little political stuff. Where are you politically? I mean, I have a sense of kind of where you're at, and everything these days feels sort of amorphous. But
you know what? I was never a political person. I just wasn't. Maybe it was because I was privileged to a degree and politics just didn't interest me. Why would they? I was a privileged white kid, and moving from high school into college during the Reagan 80s. Everything seemed whatever. I mean, I guess I complained about Reagan mindlessly, like all of my other kids in my class, and a lot of people took American Psycho to be a book that was critical of the values of the Reagan 80s. And it was critical of some of the cultural values, certainly about greed and about yuppiedom, but I had no beef with Ronald Reagan. I mean, that wasn't part of what that book was about. Some of his iconography is used in the book, but you know, he was just the president during the time that book took place. And then, you know, I was living with someone for a long time who was very invested in politics. I actually ran a couple of gubernatorial campaigns in the 90s, and I got a close-up look to that, and I just hated it. I just hated the whole notion of how it was all played out, and none of it interested me. And it really, and during the Obama era, everything's fine. I mean, I wasn't really paying attention. Something happened with Trump. Something happened with Trump that I think has happened to all of us to one degree or another. Something was announced. And again, another presidential election cycle is coming up, and I'm kind of following it, but suddenly I'm following it because it's very interesting to me how the media is treating the Donald Trump narrative. Now, I'm talking about a media that I had been following closely for 30 years and trusted somewhat. The New York Times, CNN. New York Times and CNN. All of my life. I read them, and I trusted them, and I believed in them, and it was all, they were, you know. And I began to think that they were missing the story, that they were going off a different path that really wasn't the reality. That wasn't the reality, that there was a new narrative that they were forming. And this began to bother me. And I don't know why.
I hear ya,
brother. I don't know why. I'm nonpartisan. I never saw myself as I never saw myself really. I think we have this similar trajectory. I think that I was a liberal guy who was gay and was, you know, rightly so. Yeah. Rightly so. It was fine. Never stridently, never far left or whatever, but I believed in the good fight on the liberal side. Something happened. I began to see that this side was curdling.
Yeah. Do you remember a moment? Because a lot of people have like the moment. Yeah. What was your moment?
My moment was the headline of the New York Times after, I guess it was the first or second Republican debate where Trump had gone on CNN and talked about how Megyn Kelly was bleeding through her eyes.
I think it was the first
whatever.
One.
Okay.
I think it was first. Yeah.
And I thought, okay, well, whatever. But it was the top headline at the top of the New York Times. And I thought, that is so strange. Why is that? To humiliate Trump to some degree? This was just something that you could kind of, you know, talk about minimally, but to create an entire narrative over this in order to humiliate him or to get him canceled was the beginning for me of like, oh, there's something else going on. There's a secret history here. And that is how I began to become somewhat radicalized in a way from who I thought I was to where I ended up being. And again, I have to say I'm not a partisan. I still am someone who is loath to vote. I'm in the majority of this country. And yet, what I've noticed...
You mean you didn't go to my dumpy polling station over here, where I'm pretty sure I contracted coronavirus? You weren't there yesterday?
No. I was not there, and I'm not going to be there either. What I found so interesting, and really what White, a lot of it is about how I saw the left begin to disintegrate. Yeah. And a part of the aisle that I thought I was on. I thought I was in that side of the theater. And I realized that I'm not. And I don't want to be on this side of the theater if it is this hysterical, this crazed, and also I really hated the creation of narratives that were obviously not true that were being used to undermine a legally elected president, whether I liked him or didn't like him. I just thought there was something so distinctly un-American about the way the left was creating their stories that it just began to unnerve me.
Yeah, you know what's super interesting about that David Horowitz, who we just mentioned, when I had him in here, he's a huge Trump supporter, and I asked him, do you have a moment when that happened? And he mentioned the Megyn Kelly bleeding line, because he said for him, as someone that was a conservative, but didn't understand the Trump thing, he's like, that moment got it for him because it was basically Trump being like, screw all of you, I play by none of your rules. So that same moment that sort of had you wake up from a media perspective as a lefty, for him as a conservative was like, that was why he loved Trump.
But it's so weird because yes, the Trump screw all the rules guy is what everyone loves. That's what everybody loves.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting that yet on the other side, it's what a lot of people are horrified by, who would normally love that
they're supposed to be
in
the
a
rebels,
person.
right?
And yet because it's Trump, and this is the problem with Trump, and I talk about this again in the book, it is about, I really believe it's about an aesthetic. It's about this guy and what he looks like. And I always have said that if Trump was in the package of a Mitt Romney, it might be more palatable for a lot of people, and we certainly would not have this kind of like what is truly, I believe, Trump derangement syndrome.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about politics instead of nonstop yelling, check out our politics playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, watch our full episode playlist all right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.